Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I am Gary Machuda, and this episode, we're going to ask a very interesting question. Do Lutherans have a defined canon? Is there a canon of scripture that Lutherans are required to hold on to? Well, we're going to look at some very important writings from a very influential Lutheran theologian, Arthur Piepkorn, and see what he has to say in this regard. And I think the answers he gives may surprise some. So that's what we're going to do today. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse is about to begin. Do Lutherans have a defined canon? It may surprise people to find out that they don't. And in fact, we're going to look at a very influential theologian, Lutheran theologian, Arthur Piepkorn. We're going to look at two responses he gives in a work titled The Sacred Scripture and the Lutheran Confessions, Selected Writings of Arthur Karl Piepkorn, edited by Seeker and put out by CEC Press, 2007. This is going to be found in volume 2, page 2, and later I think it's page 5 as well. We're going to look at two sections. One is his response to an inquiry from the Faculty Senate considering the suggestion that the Worship Commission of the Lutheran Church Missouri-Synod be requested to alter the term canonical to prophetic and apostolic in the formularies of the Lutheran agenda for the ordination of ministers and missionaries and the installment of professors. So they want to substitute canonical with prophetic and apostolic. And so Peipkorn's going to comment on that. And then the second one we're going to look at comes right after it in the book. This is a reply that Peipkorn makes on January 27, 1972, to an inquiry by Dr. John Ruhman of the faculty of Mount Airy Seminary in Philadelphia. It's reprinted in the Theological Observer section of the Concordia Theological Monthly 42. That would be the July-August 1972 issue, 449 and to 453. So we're going to look at a couple of the things that Peipkorn has to say in regards to the canon, and I'll throw my 2 cents in. And let's begin. So first thing he says is that the term canonical is not defined in the formularies. The term canonical is not defined in any authoritative document. The Holy Scriptures do not define the term, and Lutheran symbols do not define the term, which is very interesting that the symbols don't define exactly what Lutherans mean when they say canonical. Now, in regards to Holy Scripture, that makes a lot of sense because the word canon is an ancient term. It just means a rule, but it later became a term coined to describe the contents of sacred Scripture, the extent of inspired writings. And that occurs quite late, relatively late in church history. First known example, for example, is Saint Athanasius. Is the first to use the word canon in that sense. That's a couple hundred years after the sacred Scripture. So it's not surprising that Scripture doesn't define the meaning of this term because this term really hasn't been coined in such a way. It was much later in church history. And even Athanasius doesn't define canon. In fact, I don't know if anybody really defines canon in antiquity, at least the first 400 years of the church. They just use it. And if you look at how Athanasius uses the term canon and the books he cites and so on, you'll see that even he's not using the word canon quite in the same way we do today. We produced a series of videos on Athanasius. I'm not going to get into that, but nevertheless, Peipkorn's observation is true. It's not found in sacred Scriptures. What's surprising is the Lutheran symbols don't define the term, although they do use the term. The next thing that Peipkorn points out is that it occurs, that is canonical in regards to the contents of Scripture, occurs only once in the symbols of the Latin Augsburg Confession in chapter 22, paragraph 22, chapter 28, paragraph 28, in a document which ascribes to St. Augustine. So the only time that the Lutheran symbols actually mention canon or canonical in this sense is in the Augsburg Confession. So here's a clip of where it's used. And this is, again, section 28, paragraph 28. It says this, quote, "And Augustine, contra Peteliani epistolum, neither must we submit to Catholic bishops if they chance to err or hold anything contrary to the canonical scriptures of God," unquote. So there's the use of the word canon in regards to the scriptures. And Peipkorn makes a very interesting observation. He says, quote, "The authorship of the quoted document is uncertain, but if it were St. Augustine, we have to reckon with the fact that, in contrast to St. Jerome, St. Augustine regarded the so-called Old Testament Apocrypha as canonical scripture," unquote. So as you recall, St. Jerome was the first in antiquity to take the Deuterocanon and call it Apocrypha and reject it as spurious. However, St. Augustine affirms these books as canonical scripture. So ironically, the one time it's used in the symbols of the Lutheran formularies is a quote from Augustine. And ironically, Augustine actually holds to more canonical books than Luther did, and Lutherans do today. The term, he continues, was not defined in the Constitution or in the Articles of Incorporation of the Lutheran Church Missouri-Synod. The term canonical in Christian tradition is always relative. Now here I'm going to take some umbrage with him. I think he isn't quite right, and he kind of carefully qualifies certain things. So let me quote him. He says that it's always relative. It refers to the actual canon in use in a given diocese or province at a given time. The contents of canons vary from time to time and from place to place. The canon was never defined for the whole church by an ecumenical council. Okay. Now, canonical, varying from place to place, time to time. It's true that various canonical lists vary in their contents. So he's right there. The contents do vary time to time, place to place. We've dealt with that in pretty much every video we've done here in church history and early church fathers. We don't need to go into detail there. I don't think, however, that necessarily represents particular areas of the church. I think you really have to look at each case on a one-by-one basis and figure out what's being spoken of, what exactly is this list supposed to represent. And again, since the word canon wasn't used until Athanasius, at least that's the earliest known usage, that excludes quite a few sources that Lutherans would historically point to against the Deuterocanon. So be that as it may, I don't think that's entirely accurate. The last line I want to comment on is this: the canon was never defined for the whole church by an ecumenical council. Technically, that's wrong, of course, because the Council of Trent defines it, and it is ecumenical council. But of course, Lutherans deny Trent. So, and that's a Lutheran document, so that's fine from their perspective. That's true from their perspective, I should say. However, the canon was never defined for the whole church by an ecumenical council. Okay. Notice by an ecumenical council. Why throw that in? Why? Because the 4th century councils of Carthage and Hippo, there's 2 Carthaginian councils, defined the canon. You have a series of popes who defined the canon, Pope Innocent I and others as well, in Damasus, defined the canon. And then even you have Pope Nicholas I. Oh boy, when was he? I think he was writing in the 800s, where he says that the canon of Innocent I is a universal law of the church. You also have the African Code, those early 4th century local councils that were adopted as part of the universal law of the church. So, technically they're not ecumenical. So Peipkorn's statement's true, but it's qualified in such a sense that, it misses all that. But, there's also another difficulty here, because there is an ecumenical council that defined the inspiration of the Old and New Testament books, which include the Deuterocanon, and they affirmed with ecumenical status that these books are inspired by God. But that's shared by East and West. That is part of the universal law of the church, and that occurred a couple hundred years before the Reformation. Now, as Lutheran dogmatics, many times one of the core reasons for what is a canon is its inspiration. We have, in a sense, the Council of Florence affirming the canonicity of these books indirectly by affirming their inspiration. So it did, Peipkorn's statement's true because they didn't use the word canon at Florence. They were focused more on divine authorship. But, divine authorship is the basis for the canon. And so de facto, you do have an ecumenical council affirming the canon, but technically he's right. He qualifies it in such a way. Okay, now a couple other things he notes in the next section of the book on the use of the deuterocanonical books in Lutheran theology that are worth noting. So I'm only going to pick a couple. Lutheran symbolical books nowhere define prophetic and apostolic scriptures, like you mentioned earlier. The term is apparently a way of denoting the Old and New Testament. It itself says nothing about the inclusion of the deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament among the prophetic scriptures or their exclusion from the prophetic scriptures. In other words, even when they do use prophetic and apostolic scriptures to describe the Old and New Testament, it doesn't really say anything about whether or not the Deuterocanon is part of the prophetic scriptures. A second point that Peipkorn makes is this, quote, the Jewish canon was not definitively fixed until late in the 1st century of our era. That's very interesting. And, even though this is 1972, research there, that there was consensus that it happened late in the 1st century. Now it's the beginning of the 2nd century, but nevertheless, it's important and substantially correct. That is, Rabbinic Judaism did not fix the canon prior to their coming into existence in the 2nd Christian century. Peipkorn continues, one cannot conclude, therefore, from the New Testament, the scope of the Old Testament canon. And I think that's very astute, because after all, if the canon amongst the Jews was not fixed until after the time of the New Testament, obviously the New Testament can't reflect in an earlier canon because it simply didn't exist. Peipkorn continues, although the New Testament depends extensively on the Septuagint, and although there are many parallels and apparent allusions in the New Testament to the deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament, the absence from the New Testament of a clear citation of deuterocanonical book as scripture leaves the question of the place of these books in Lutheran thought open. So that's his assessment of the New Testament evidence in regards to Lutheran thought. Of course, I would point out that you would have to look at how these books are used, how, when the New Testament references and how it references and alludes to these books, whether that could indicate authority. That apparently didn't show up on his radar screen. And of course, a clear citation as scripture. And again, the explicit, clear citation of a book as scripture in the New Testament is an argument from silence. And of course, the New Testament doesn't quote from every Old Testament book, even in the Protestant Bible, explicitly as scripture or something like that. It quotes from a lot of them, but not all. So that's not definitive. So I can see his point where this could be an open question within Lutheran thought. Fair enough. And then the concluding zinger at the end, I think may be surprising to some. But Peipkorn says, quote, unlike the Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, and Reformed communities, all of which produced a list of canonical books, the Lutheran symbolical books nowhere list the books of the biblical canon, unquote. So unlike all these different groups, Lutherans never published a definitive or defined list of canonical books. And so that, I think, would surprise a lot of people, especially non-Lutherans, maybe even some Lutherans, that, you know what, you never really did define what the canon is. So God willing, that sets the stage for what I hope to do a series of videos on the reception of the deuterocanonical books within Lutheranism, because Luther's view of the Deuterocanon, both Old and New Testament, is quite a bit different than how, let's say, modern day Missouri-Synod Lutherans understand it. And so I'd like to trace the trajectory of how those changes occurred in Lutheran thought from Luther to today. I think that'd be very interesting, but I need to finish up my research in this regard before I do the video. So please keep me in your prayers. And if you like this video or you like any of the videos on this channel, please subscribe. Please do the thumbs up. And also, by the way, William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. We appreciate your support because your financial support enables us to buy resources to produce videos like this. So until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Everybody have a great week. Bye-bye.